Vasily Lomachenko had never been the kind of fighter to let fear creep into his mind. He had built his entire career on precision, speed, and an almost surgical ability to dismantle opponents in the ring. Every move he made was calculated, every punch thrown with a purpose, every fight a carefully crafted symphony of skill and experience. He wasn't just a boxer, he was an artist, painting his legacy across the sport one fight at a time. But on this particular night, something was different. Something was off. The moment he stepped into his locker room at the arena, a cold sensation ran down his spine, an unease he couldn't quite shake. At first, he thought maybe it was just nerves. It wasn't unusual for a fighter to feel the weight of the moment before a big match. But this wasn't nerves. This was something else. As he approached his locker, he noticed the faint rustling of paper, the edge of a folded note sticking out just beneath his gloves. His heartbeat quickened as he reached for it, unfolding the message with steady hands, but what he read made his stomach tighten. It was just a few words, hastily scrawled in black ink, but they carried a weight heavier than any opponent he had ever faced. The message was chilling in its simplicity: walk away now, or you won't walk at all. The words stared back at him, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste, or perhaps by a trembling hand. He read it again, his mind racing. Was this a joke? A mind game? Someone trying to mess with his head before the fight? That kind of thing wasn't unheard of in boxing. Fighters and their camps sometimes played psychological tricks, looking for any edge they could get. But something about this didn't feel like a simple intimidation tactic. This wasn't just trash talk. This felt personal. Lomachenko's eyes darted around the locker room, scanning for anyone out of place. His team was just outside, talking amongst themselves, preparing for the fight as if nothing had happened. If someone had come in here, if someone had placed this note, they had done it without being seen. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been in dangerous situations before. Growing up in Ukraine, training under his father's relentless guidance, fighting his way to the top of the sport, he knew what pressure felt like. But this was different. This wasn't the pressure of an opponent staring him down across the ring. This was something unseen, something lurking in the shadows, something that made his hands feel just a little colder than usual. He knew he had a choice. He could ignore it, brush it off as an empty threat and go on with the fight as planned. Or he could take it seriously, step away, and avoid whatever danger might be waiting for him beyond that ring. But walking away wasn't in his nature. He folded the note and slipped it into his duffel bag, his mind already working through every possibility. He had a fight to win, but now, there was something else in the back of his mind, something gnawing at him. Who had left this? And why? Was it someone from the other camp? A disgruntled gambler who had too much money riding on the outcome? Or was it something deeper, something darker? He didn't have time to dwell on it. His coach's voice cut through the silence, calling him out of the locker room. The arena was waiting. The crowd was waiting. His opponent was waiting. Lomachenko took one last glance at his locker before turning toward the door. Whatever was happening, whatever this threat meant, he wasn't going to let it control him. But as he stepped out into the bright lights of the arena, the weight of those words stayed with him, pressing down on him heavier than any punch he had ever taken. The fight itself was a blur. Every jab, every dodge, every counterpunch felt almost mechanical, as if his body was moving on instinct while his mind was elsewhere. The crowd roared, the commentators shouted, but he barely registered any of it. He won the fight, his opponent never stood a chance, but even in victory, something felt hollow. He knew this wasn't over. That note wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. And whoever had written it wasn't done with him yet. Back in the locker room, as his team celebrated around him, he reached for his bag, his fingers brushing against the folded paper. His stomach twisted. He needed answers. But as he unfolded it one more time, his breath caught in his throat. The ink had smudged even more, but now, something else had been added. A second message, written in the same hurried handwriting. This was your last chance. His pulse pounded in his ears. Someone had been in here again. While he was in the ring, while all eyes were on the fight, someone had slipped into his locker room undetected. His hands clenched around the paper. This wasn't a game. It wasn't just intimidation. This was real. He didn't say anything to his team. Not yet. He needed to think. He needed to figure out his next move. But as he sat there, the adrenaline of the fight fading, replaced by a different kind of tension, he knew one thing for sure: whoever was behind this wasn't finished. And if they were serious about their threat, his career, his future, maybe even his life, was in danger. Lomachenko sat in the corner of the locker room, his body cooling down from the fight, but his mind was far from calm. The energy of the win had already faded, replaced by something heavier, something pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. The second message on the note was still fresh in his mind. This wasn't just some random threat. Someone had been watching him closely, someone who had access to places they shouldn't have. The realization left an uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He glanced around the room, trying to act natural, but every sound, every movement suddenly felt like it carried more meaning. His team was celebrating, laughing, packing up the gear, oblivious to the storm building in his head. They had no idea what he had just found. He wasn't sure if he should tell them. Not yet. The last thing he wanted was to cause panic, to let this thing get in his head more than it already had. He forced himself to breathe, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe it was just someone trying to get under his skin, some gambler with too much money on the line, or a fan with a twisted sense of humor. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He had been in this sport too long, had seen too much to believe that this was just a harmless prank. The precision of it, the timing, it all felt too deliberate. Whoever was behind it wasn't just trying to scare him. They wanted him to feel trapped. And the worst part? It was working. The ride back to the hotel was quiet. His team was still buzzing from the victory, but he barely spoke, lost in his own thoughts. The city lights blurred past the car window, and for the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable. Not in the ring, he had faced plenty of dangerous opponents before. But this was different. This was something he couldn't see, something lurking just beyond his reach. When they arrived at the hotel, he went straight to his room, locking the door behind him. He pulled the note out of his bag, reading it again under the dim light of the bedside lamp. This was your last chance. The words were almost taunting him now. He had no idea who wrote them or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound in the hallway, every creak in the walls, made him tense. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't shut off. He kept thinking about the fight, about the moment he found the first note, about the fact that someone had managed to slip into his locker room twice without being seen. It didn't add up. The security at the arena was tight. There were cameras, guards, checkpoints. Whoever did this had to know exactly what they were doing. That meant they weren't just some random fan or a jealous opponent. This was planned. And that meant they were willing to go to great lengths to get their message across. By morning, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to find out who was behind this. But he couldn't just go around asking questions without raising suspicions. He needed to be smart about it. The first thing he did was check his phone, scrolling through messages, emails, anything that might give him a clue. Nothing. No strange calls, no cryptic texts. If they wanted him to know who they weren't making it easy. That made him uneasy. It meant they were confident. They weren't afraid of being caught. That kind of certainty only came from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. At breakfast, he sat with his team, listening to them talk about the fight, the next steps, what came next in his career. But his mind was somewhere else. He kept scanning the room, watching people, looking for anything unusual. The hotel was filled with fans, reporters, other fighters. Any one of them could be connected to this. Or none of them. That was the part that bothered him the most. He had no idea where the threat was coming from. His coach noticed his silence. "You good?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Lomachenko nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just tired," he said, keeping his voice steady. His coach didn't push, but he could tell he wasn't convinced. He had been with him long enough to know when something was off. But for now, he let it go. The next few days were restless. He kept expecting something else to happen, another note, another message. But nothing came. It was almost worse than the initial threats. The waiting, the uncertainty. He found himself looking over his shoulder more than usual, scanning every crowd, every unfamiliar face. He was starting to feel paranoid, but he knew he couldn't afford to ignore it. Then, on the third night after the fight, something happened that made his stomach drop. He had gone out for a run, trying to clear his mind, to get some sense of normalcy back. The streets were quiet, the air cool against his skin. For a little while, he almost felt like himself again. But as he turned down a side street, something caught his eye, a shadow, just a few steps behind him. He didn't stop, didn't turn his head, but he knew someone was there. They had been following him. His heart rate picked up, but he kept his pace steady, pretending he hadn't noticed. If they wanted to scare him, he wasn't going to let them see it. He took a longer route back to the hotel, weaving through different streets, testing them. But no matter where he went, they were still there, just out of reach, just close enough for him to feel it. By the time he made it back to his room, his adrenaline was surging. He locked the door behind him, pressing his back against it, his breath coming in steady but deep. This wasn't just some warning anymore. They were watching him. Following him. And that meant one thing: they weren't done yet. The next morning, he made a decision. He couldn't just sit back and wait for whatever was coming next. He had to do something. But he needed to be careful. Whoever they were already ahead of him. They had access, information, timing. If he made a wrong move, they would know. He had to be smart. He had to be patient. But most of all, he had to be ready, because whatever was coming next, he had a feeling it would be worse than a note in his locker. And this time, he might not be able to ignore it. Lomachenko couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It had settled into his bones now, a constant presence lurking at the edge of his awareness. Every step he took, every door he passed, every glance from a stranger felt like it held a hidden meaning. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was letting the notes and the shadow from his run get inside his head, but deep down, he knew this wasn't just in his imagination. Someone was out there, someone who wanted him to feel this exact way, trapped, uncertain, looking over his shoulder. And it was working. He hadn't told anyone yet, not even his team. He knew how it would go. They'd brush it off, tell him he was overthinking it, or worse, start treating him like he was fragile, like he couldn't handle the pressure. That wasn't an option. He had built his career on being unshakable. If word got out that he was distracted, that he was letting something off the mat get to him, it would spread like wildfire. He couldn't afford that. He needed to figure this out on his own. The next morning, he left the hotel early, before the rest of his team was awake. The streets were still quiet, the city barely stirring. He walked with purpose, letting his instincts take over. If someone was following him, if someone was watching, he needed to flush them out. He stopped at a small cafe, ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and waited. His eyes moved through the street, scanning the faces, looking for anything out of place. It didn't take long. Across the road, near a newspaper stand, stood a man in a dark jacket and cap, his posture too stiff, too deliberate. He wasn't looking directly at Lomachenko, but he didn't have to. His presence was enough. Lomachenko had spent years studying movement, reading body language, learning to predict what an opponent would do before they even did it. This man wasn't just standing there by chance. He was here for a reason. Lomachenko didn't react. He took slow sips of his coffee, acting like he hadn't noticed. But his mind was working fast, calculating his next move. He needed to know if this was the same person who had followed him the night before, or if there was more than one of them. He finished his coffee, grabbed his bag, and stepped out onto the street. He didn't look back, didn't give any sign that he knew. He just started walking, heading toward the quieter part of the city, weaving through streets, taking turns at random, testing his shadow. And sure enough, the man followed. Not too close, not obvious, but always there, always just a few steps behind. Lomachenko's pulse quickened, but he kept his pace steady. He needed to lose him, needed to create some distance. He turned a corner sharply, then ducked into an alleyway, pressing himself against the wall. He listened. Footsteps. Slow, careful. The man was being cautious, but he was coming closer. Lomachenko's muscles tensed, his instincts taking over. He wasn't in the ring, but this was still a fight, just a different kind. As soon as the man stepped past the alley's entrance, Lomachenko moved. He grabbed the man's jacket, spun him around, and pinned him against the wall in one swift motion. Their eyes locked. The man wasn't surprised. He had expected this. "Who are you?" Lomachenko's voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. He needed information, something concrete, something that could give him a lead. He couldn't just sit around waiting for the next move. But that was the hardest part. Who could he even trust? His team was loyal, but they were focused on his career, on his fights. If he told them what was happening, they'd either dismiss it as nothing or go to the authorities, and that could backfire. He had seen what happened when fighters got caught up in scandals, even ones they weren't responsible for. The media would spin it into a circus, and once that happened, control would slip through his fingers. No, he had to handle this himself, at least for now. That night, he decided to test the waters. He went down to the hotel bar, keeping his posture relaxed, acting like nothing was wrong. If someone was watching him, he wanted to see if they'd take the bait. He ordered a drink, leaned back, scanned the room through the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. A mix of tourists, business people, a few locals. Normal. But then, there toward the far end, near the window. A man, different from the one in the alley but with the same air about him. Sitting alone, not drinking, just watching. Not directly at Lomachenko, but close enough. Keeping him in his periphery. Lomachenko didn't react, just turned back to his drink, keeping his expression neutral. It was confirmation. They weren't done. They were still here. He sat there for another 20 minutes, making small talk with the bartender, pretending to check his phone. Then, without looking back, he got up and left, moving with steady, measured steps. He didn't head straight to his room. Instead, he took a detour through the hotel's side corridors, the kind that guests rarely used, passing through service areas, hallways meant for staff. He moved quietly, listening. And then, just as he had suspected, footsteps. Slow. Careful. Someone was following him. His pulse picked up, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned a corner sharply, stopping just out of sight. The footsteps came closer. Closer. Then, as the figure stepped into view, Lomachenko moved. Fast. He grabbed the man by the collar, shoving him against the wall in a controlled but firm hold. Their eyes met. This time, the man wasn't calm. His eyes flickered with surprise, with something close to fear. "Who are you working for?" Lomachenko's voice was low, steady, but there was no mistaking the intensity behind it. The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, before Lomachenko could press further, the man smirked. And that was when he felt it, the shift, the moment he realized he had made a mistake. The man didn't fight back. He didn't resist. Instead, he let out a short breath, as if he had expected this. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lomachenko's grip tightened. "What does that mean?" But before he could get an answer, the man did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket not for a weapon, but for a small folded piece of paper. He held it out, waiting. Lomachenko hesitated for a second before snatching it, keeping his grip firm on the man's jacket. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. And that was when his stomach dropped. "This isn't about you." The words were simple, but they hit like a punch to the gut. He looked up, his mind racing. "Then who?" he demanded. The man's smirk widened just slightly. "You'll see soon enough." And before Lomachenko could stop him, he moved, twisting just enough to slip free, disappearing down the hall before he could react. Lomachenko didn't chase him. He just stood there, staring at the note, the words burning into his mind. This wasn't just about him. That changed everything. If it wasn't him they were targeting, then who? Someone in his team? Someone close to him? The realization sent a chill through him. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was something else. And he had no idea how deep it went. Lomachenko's grip on the note tightened as his thoughts spiraled into chaos. The words on the paper played over and over in his mind. "This isn't about you." It had felt personal from the beginning, the way they had tracked his movements, left messages only he would find, followed him through the streets with a quiet but deliberate presence. But if it wasn't him they were after, then who? And why go through the trouble of targeting him to send that message? His gut told him this was just the surface of something far bigger, something that had been in motion long before he noticed the first signs. The man had gotten away, but he had left this on purpose, as if to push him in a different direction. Someone wanted him looking elsewhere. But why? And more importantly, how much danger was the real target in? A cold unease settled in his stomach as he thought through every possibility. His team? His family? Someone from his past? His first instinct was to check on the people closest to him, but he hesitated. If this was a game, a psychological trap meant to push him toward a mistake, he couldn't move too fast or too predictably. He had to be careful. He shoved the note into his pocket, forcing himself to take steady breaths as he walked back to his room. The hallways felt different now, like the walls were pressing in, like unseen eyes followed him even here. He checked his phone as soon as he locked the door behind him. No new messages, no missed calls. He knew better than to take that as a good sign. He scrolled through his recent conversations, looking for anything unusual. His trainer had messaged earlier about a schedule change. His manager had confirmed an interview. Routine things. But then, his finger stopped. A message from a number he didn't recognize. No name. Just a single line. Time's running out. The breath left his lungs, his mind snapping to full attention. He stared at the screen, willing it to make sense, but there was nothing to go on, no context, no demand, no clue as to who had sent it. He had half a mind to call the number, but something told him it wouldn't do any good. Whoever was behind this had planned every step so far. They weren't careless. They wanted him unsettled. And they were succeeding. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. If they were warning him about time, then something was already in motion. Whatever this was, it was reaching a breaking point. He needed to act before it was too late. His first call was to his father, not out of fear, but because he needed to hear his voice, needed to make sure nothing was out of the ordinary. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Calm. Steady. The same as always. Relief washed over him, but it was brief. He kept the conversation short, casual, asking about home, about training, waiting for any sign of something being off. There was nothing. Everything was normal. At least, as far as his father knew. But that only deepened the mystery. If this wasn't about his family, then who? His mind shifted to his team. He needed to see them in person, gauge their reactions, make sure no one had been approached or threatened. If whoever was behind this wanted to keep him distracted, they wouldn't go after someone obvious. They'd go after someone he wouldn't expect. He made his way to the gym, his pulse steady but his thoughts racing. When he walked in, the familiar sounds of training filled the air, gloves hitting pads, voices calling out instructions, the rhythmic shuffle of footwork on the canvas. It was a normal day, but that only made him more uneasy. He moved through the space, his eyes scanning every face. His trainer was in the corner, working with a younger fighter, his focus locked in. His cutman was watching a sparring session, arms crossed. His teammates were scattered across the gym, working through drills. Everything looked fine. But then, just as he was about to let his guard down, he caught at something subtle, something small, but undeniable. One of his team members, a guy who had been with him for years, wasn't acting right. He was distracted, his movements slower than usual, his focus slipping. And when Lomachenko stepped closer, their eyes met, and there it was. Fear. It was only for a second, a flicker before it was buried, but Lomachenko had seen it enough times in the ring to know when someone was trying to hide it. He didn't react, didn't press it right away. Instead, he walked past, pretending he hadn't noticed. If this was connected, if this was the piece he had been missing, then whoever was behind this had already gotten to someone close. And that meant the real fight had already begun. He finished his training, keeping his routine as normal as possible, but the whole time, his mind was working. He watched his teammate closely, noting the hesitations, the glances toward his phone, the stiffness in his posture. It wasn't just nerves. This was something else. After practice, he waited. He stayed behind as the others left, lingering just long enough to make sure they were alone. His teammate moved toward the locker room, but Lomachenko was already there, leaning against the doorframe when he turned the corner. The moment their eyes met again, the fear was back, this time more pronounced. Talk to me, Lomachenko said, his voice low, controlled. His teammate hesitated, looking away, his jaw tightening. I don't know what you're talking about. But the way his hands clenched into fists, the way his shoulders tensed, it told Lomachenko everything he needed to know. Don't do that, he said. Don't lie to me. Not about this. Silence. His teammate swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. Then, finally, he exhaled. I didn't want to drag you into it, he muttered. I thought if I just went along with it, it would go away. Lomachenko's pulse quickened. What did they tell you? His teammate ran a hand over his face, shaking his head. It started a few weeks ago. Someone started asking questions about you. Not just about fights, about you. Your schedule. Your habits. At first, I thought it was just some journalist fishing for a story. But then the messages started coming. Threats. Lomachenko's stomach tightened. What kind of threats? His teammate hesitated, then pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his messages, then handed it over. Lomachenko's eyes moved over the screen, and the words hit him like a punch to the ribs. If you don't do as you're told, he won't make it to the fight. Everything clicked into place. The warnings, the messages, the feeling of being watched. It was never just about rattling him. It was about control. Someone had been using his teammate to keep tabs on him, to manipulate his surroundings without him even realizing it. And now, the threats were escalating. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games anymore. They were making their move. Lomachenko handed the phone back, his expression unreadable, but inside, a storm was brewing. This wasn't just about intimidation. This was about something bigger. Someone out there had been waiting for the right moment, pulling strings in the background, setting the stage. And now, time was running out. The fight wasn't just in the ring anymore. It was out here, in the shadows. And for the first time in his career, Lomachenko wasn't just fighting for a title. He was fighting to stay ahead of something he still didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear: whoever was behind this had just made a mistake. Because now, Lomachenko wasn't just reacting. He was ready to fight back. Lomachenko stood in the dimly lit hallway of the gym, his pulse steady but his mind sharper than ever. Everything had led to this moment. The messages, the threats, the feeling of being watched, it had all been leading him to uncover something bigger than himself. And now, with his teammate's revelation still fresh in his mind, he knew there was no more time to hesitate. Whoever was behind this had been careful, staying in the shadows, pulling strings without revealing themselves. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated him. He didn't leave the gym immediately. He stayed back, watching, waiting, letting the weight of the situation settle in. His teammate had been forced into silence, manipulated by threats, but the fact that he had finally spoken meant that things were escalating. He pulled out his phone, scrolling back to the unknown messages, the cryptic warnings, the unseen hand guiding everything from the darkness. He had spent his entire career learning how to read his opponents, how to anticipate their next move before they made it. This was no different. If someone was playing a game, then they were nearing their final move. A sudden vibration in his pocket snapped his focus back. Another message. His grip tightened as he read it. Step out now. No security. Just you. It wasn't a request. It was a command. He glanced toward the entrance of the gym, the doors seeming heavier than before. He had two choices: walk out and face whoever was waiting, or ignore it and wait for them to strike from the shadows. But waiting wasn't an option anymore. He had spent too long playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. He moved toward the doors, his breath steady, his hands relaxed but ready. The moment he stepped outside, the cold night air wrapped around him, the silence stretching too far, too empty. Then he saw a black car parked just ahead, engine running, headlights off. A figure stood beside it, barely visible in the dim streetlight. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They wanted him to see them. To know that this was real. He took slow steps forward, his eyes locked on the silhouette. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for anything. As he got closer, the figure finally spoke. You're not as easy to shake as I thought. The voice was familiar, but something about it felt wrong, as if it carried a weight that had been hidden for too long. Then, the person stepped into the light, and the world tilted. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some nameless threat lurking in the distance. It was someone he had trusted. Someone he had fought alongside. Someone who had been with him from the beginning. His trainer. Lomachenko's breath caught in his chest, his mind struggling to process the reality standing in front of him. You. The word barely left his lips, disbelief settling deep in his bones. His trainer sighed, shaking his head. I never wanted it to come to this. But you left me no choice. The pieces clicked together faster than he could stop them. The inside knowledge. The subtle shifts in training. The way the threats had always pushed him toward fear but never toward the truth. It had all been controlled. Manipulated. Designed to make him doubt, to make him hesitate. And all this time, the person pulling the strings had been right beside him. Lomachenko's fists tightened. Why? His trainer's expression hardened. Because you don't understand the business. You think it's just about the fights, about what happens in the ring. But it's not. It's about control. And you were never meant to win this fight. Not this one. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't just about him. It was about money, influence, power. Someone had decided that he wasn't supposed to walk away victorious, and his own trainer had been the one making sure that happened. The fights weren't just about skill anymore. They were about deals made in the dark, about outcomes determined before the first bell even rang. Lomachenko took another step closer. And what now? You think I'll just walk away? His trainer let out a slow breath, as if weighing his next words carefully. No, he said. I think you'll do what's smart. You'll take the fall. You'll walk into that ring and you'll lose, and then this all goes away. No more messages. No more threats. You just let it happen. Lomachenko stared at him, his mind racing, his heart steady. For the first time since this had started, he saw the whole picture. They had never wanted him out of the fight. They had wanted to break him before he even stepped into the ring, to make sure that by the time the world was watching, the outcome had already been decided. But they had made a mistake. Lomachenko had never been one to follow a script. He had never been one to take the easy way out. And if they thought he was going to go down without a fight, then they had no idea who they were dealing with. He exhaled, his voice calm. If you really knew me, you know I don't lose on command. His trainer's face darkened. Then you leave me no choice. The car door opened, and another figure stepped out. Someone bigger, someone built for one purpose: to make sure Lomachenko didn't make it to that fight. The air crackled with tension as the man moved toward him, his presence casting a long shadow in the dim light. But Lomachenko didn't move. He had been fighting his whole life, in and out of the ring. He had faced giants, he had faced doubt, and he had never once backed down. This would be no different. As the man lunged, Lomachenko reacted on instinct. He slipped the first strike, his movements precise, controlled. A quick pivot, a sharp counter. The man staggered, caught off guard by the speed, by the precision. Lomachenko didn't hesitate. Another step, another strike faster than they could follow. The fight was over before it had even started. His trainer's face twisted in shock, in frustration, and something close to fear. You don't know what you've done, he hissed. But Lomachenko only shook his head. No. I know exactly what I've done. He turned, walking away without another word. Because now, the real fight was ahead of him. And this time, he wasn't just stepping into the ring to win a title. He was stepping in to prove that no one, no deal, no threat, no betrayal could decide his fate. The fight was his. And he was going to win it on his own terms. Lomachenko walked away from the confrontation, his pulse steady, his breath controlled, but inside, something burned deep, something stronger than anger, more profound than betrayal. He had spent his life dedicated to this sport, built his legacy with his own two hands, and now he had been forced to see the ugliest side of it. The people he had trusted, the ones who had been there since the beginning, had tried to break him, had tried to make him something he was not. But he wasn't someone who took the easy way out. He wasn't someone who would let others dictate his destiny. The night air was sharp against his skin as he walked, his mind running through everything that had happened. The threats, the warnings, the manipulation, it all made sense now. This had never been about hurting him physically. It had been about control. If they had broken him before the fight, if they had made him doubt himself, hesitate at the wrong moment, then they wouldn't have needed to touch him at all. But they had underestimated him. They had thought fear would stop him, that pressure would crack him. They had forgotten who he was. The weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders as he made his way back to his hotel. The fight was still on. No matter what they had planned, no matter what they still might try, he wasn't walking away. If anything, he was more certain now than ever. This wasn't just about winning. This was about proving that no amount of money, no backroom deal, no threat, could define what happened in the ring. As he stepped into his room, the silence felt heavier than usual. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his hands resting on his knees. He had spent years perfecting his craft, training his body to move with precision, with discipline. But this was different. This wasn't just another opponent, another challenge. This was personal. And for the first time in his career, the fight wasn't just about skill. It was about defiance. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. But even through the fatigue, there was a fire inside him that refused to dim. They had tried to scare him, tried to control him, but they had failed. And now, he was going to step into that ring with nothing holding him back. The morning came too soon, the weight of the day settling over him the moment he opened his eyes. The arena would be filled with thousands of fans, all waiting, all expecting a fight that would define the night. But none of them knew what was really at stake. None of them knew the battle that had already been fought before the first bell had even rung. He arrived at the venue, his team moving around him, the usual chaos of fight night surrounding him. But he barely heard any of it. He had one focus. One purpose. His hands were wrapped, the gloves laced tight. Every movement was familiar, muscle memory guiding him through the routine. But his mind was somewhere else. The face of his trainer, the betrayal, the weight of knowing that someone he had trusted had been working against him, it lingered, just beneath the surface. Then, the moment came. The walk to the ring. The roar of the crowd, the blinding lights, the energy vibrating through the air. But he didn't hear any of it. His heartbeat was steady, his mind locked in. His opponent stood across from him, unaware of everything that had led to this moment. To him, this was just another fight. But to Lomachenko, it was everything. The bell rang, and the first punch was thrown. The world outside the ring disappeared. There was no conspiracy, no threats, no manipulation. There was only movement, instinct, the rhythm of the fight. His opponent was strong, skilled, dangerous, but Lomachenko was sharper. Every step, every counter, every angle, it all came together like a symphony. He wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to prove that no one, not even those closest to him, could take away what he had built. The rounds passed in a blur of motion, of sweat, of strategy. His body moved without hesitation, his mind clear. He was faster, more precise, more relentless. And then, in a single moment, it was over. His fist connected, the impact reverberating through his arm, through the canvas, through the air. His opponent staggered, fell, and the referee stepped in. The crowd erupted, but Lomachenko didn't celebrate. He stood still, breathing heavily, his gloves raised, but his expression unreadable. The victory wasn't just on the scorecards. It wasn't just about another title, another belt. It was about reclaiming what was his. His control. His integrity. His legacy. As he walked back to the locker room, the weight of everything finally began to settle. He had done it. He had stood against the pressure, against the people who had tried to control him, and he had walked away victorious. But even with the win, there was an ache inside him that had nothing to do with the fight. His trainer, the man who had guided him, taught him, shaped him, had turned against him. And no matter how strong he was, no matter how much he had overcome, that was something he couldn't just shake off. He sat down, unwrapping his hands slowly, staring at the floor. The room was quiet, the chaos outside fading into the distance. The fight was over, but the scars it had left weren't the kind that healed overnight. He had won, but at a cost. The sport that had given him everything had also taken something away. The trust, the belief that the people in his corner would always be there, that was gone. But even through the loss, through the pain of knowing how close he had come to being broken, there was something else. Strength. Not the kind that came from training, from years of discipline, but the kind that came from knowing that no matter what had been thrown at him, he had stood his ground. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, his face bruised, his eyes sharp, he knew one thing for certain. They had tried to break him. They had failed. And no matter what came next, he would always be the one standing in the ring, fighting on his own terms.